Because I think when an object carries memory and that's part of its soul, then I think you've really got something special, something really wonderful, which somebody will fall in love with and want to keep for a very long time.
Hey everyone, on this week's episode, I'm joined in the studio by the British designer Jay Osgerby of the London-based industrial design studio Barber Osgerby. I wanted to have Jay on the show in large part because while Barber Osgerby's work is undoubtedly characterized by its emphasis on experimentation and innovation, their approach to all that they do, from products and furniture to architecture and interiors, is also decidedly slow, considered, and material and craft forward. Manufacturing and making are at the heart of their practice, and Jay, more than most people I've met over the years, and this is saying something since I used to run a design magazine for much of the 2010s, has a very close understanding of and incredibly deep curiosity about how things work and are made. Jay and his partner in the firm, Edward Barber, are exacting in what they design and produce, and very particular about who they make it with. And yet, highly sought after as they are, they have still managed to do a lot, designing everything from an Olympic torch for the 2012 London Olympic Games, to a 2 British pound coin, to a Victoria and Albert Museum installation, to lamps for the Italian lighting brand Floss. Jay is, at his heart, a long-view designer and, as you'll hear, someone who thinks a lot about the importance of being a good ancestor. Across their nearly 30-year history as a studio, Barber Osgerby has taken a fewer better things approach, creating pragmatic, matter-of-fact designs with poetic simplicity, material rigor, and more often than not, a subtle social agenda. Their body of work, in my view, encapsulates the best kind of design today. Clear, calm, and considered, yet certainly full of character, their pieces feel both inevitable and practical for everyday use, and espouse timelessness over trends. In a world full of flashy designs and loud objects that feel like they need to shout simply to stand out, Barber Osgerby's elegant creations take the opposite tack. On this episode, Jay and I talk about his optimistic views on AI as a means toward more people engaging in craft and handwork, what all the time over the years he has spent in factories and around craftspeople has taught him about human ingenuity, and the power of surrounding yourself with objects that are imbued with memory. Before we get into the episode, I'd first like to thank our Season 12 presenting sponsor, the high jewelry maison Van Cleef & Arpels, which this year is collaborating with the American Museum of Natural History in New York to present the exhibition Cosmic Splendor, Jewelry from the Collections of Van Cleef & Arpels, an awe-inspiring assemblage of jewelry creations, timepieces, and precious objects with astronomical references from the Maison's patrimonial collection, as well as from private loans. From dramatic necklaces depicting rockets in flight, to gem-encrusted pendants inspired by distant nebulae, to watches with intricate mechanisms that trace the transit of planetary bodies. Cosmic Splendor features nearly 70 astrological, celestial, and mythological creations that celebrate the wonders and mysteries of the cosmos. Among the enchanting universe of pieces on display are a yellow gold and ruby moon pendant from 1969 that's a celebration of the Apollo 11 moon landing, a yellow gold zodiac bracelet from 1973, and 2021 double galaxies clips, characterized by their evocative swirling designs. These works trace the stylistic evolution and the level of expertise that the high jewelry maison, founded in Paris's Place Vendôme in 1906, has developed throughout its history. You can purchase admission tickets or learn more about Cosmic Splendor at amnh.org/exhibitions. That's amnh.org/exhibitions. And now, here's my conversation with Jay. Hi, Jay. Welcome to Time Sensitive.
Hello. Thanks very much for having me.
I wanted to start just by acknowledging that for years now, all these time-sensitive interviews have been conducted under the monastic glow of your bellhop table lamp from Floss here. It's on the table in between us. And so technically you've been present in all of these interviews.
Well, I mean, I thought actually you'd bought it for me, especially. So I'm a little disappointed it's been here all the time. But I do like the fact you've got a loop table upstairs as well, which is...
Yeah. I mean, I wanted to say actually, so that we record these in the basement of this home, and upstairs in the living room is your loop coffee table. It's one of my favorite furniture objects.
Oh, thank you.
In our home.
It's great. It's very nice to come here actually, because it felt like home actually straight away to me.
Oh, good. Well, it's interesting because soon it's not going to be our home. My wife and I are moving actually this Friday. So this is our grand finale interview of Time Sensitive in this space before we're in a new space and recording in a new studio next week. In a way, it's kind of special to bring the designer who created some of the hominess into this space for this last interview.
Well, we should call it Just in Time then.
Just in time. Well, let's begin with a big provocative question.
Oh, God. Okay.
Let
me have some coffee first.
In a recent magazine interview, Edward Barber, your partner at Barber Osgerby, and you pondered whether having an ancestor who was a designer might be shameful. Or that's what the writer wrote.
Yes, that's right. Yeah, I think I described our business as being perceived, in the future as the equivalent of having a slave trader in the family, for example. Somebody who, or a career, or somebody who was so involved with a system which was, by future standards, by any standards, I suppose, non-compatible with the ethics of life.
Such a big question to think about, because 100 years, 200, 300, 400 years from now, it's like, what is your legacy? And so I guess this was the big question I wanted to ask.
Yeah, thanks for that, by the way.
As a designer, what do you hope to leave behind? Like, what do you hope you're remembered for?
In a way, I think this comes back to the way that one's career can be sort of subdivided into epochs or periods of time. Part of me wants to say that I haven't yet done what I hope I'm remembered for. I think that there are things that we've done over the years which I'm incredibly proud of in the studio, and some of which will physically exist. Over the years, we've done some really crazy things like, we've designed currency. We designed a £2 coin that was in general circulation. These things exist.
That's probably your most mass circulated object, I would say.
Well, technically, it was. They made 18 million of them, which, by some margin, is by far the most produced thing that I think we've ever done. Yeah, and so we made 18 million of them, and it was really amazing to get them in your change. When you bought something. I think your question was, of the things that have been designed, what would be remembered? I mean, I guess the Olympic torch is another one. On the whole, I think projects that we've done, that I've worked on over the years, which have a wider symbolism or wider meaning than purely something to buy. Like a £2 coin, you don't choose. Olympic torch, no one had the choice to have that. That was the object that represented the country. We've worked on installations for the Victoria and Albert Museum, for the first Design Biennale. These are sort of sculptures, actually, that represent a place and a time and other things. They, for me, have more meaning, I think, than a sort of casual product on the whole.
I would also add, and, thinking about your work, and we'll definitely dig into the philosophy that underpins your practice, but I would say, in essence, being a good ancestor is part of what you're trying to leave behind, by making things that stand the test of time, and by reason of that are sustainable. So back to this sort of environmental, would you agree with all of that?
Well, yes, I would. And the other thing I think that's actually interesting in terms of situating me in the world is that I grew up in a time where I felt like I grew up and I was surrounded by time and memory and an ongoing connection to my ancestors, actually. I had all my grandparents when I was young. They were still around. They were pretty young, and they carried lots of stories. There was a lot of the Second World War was very present in my family in the 70s. You know, I was born 25 years after the end of the Second World War.
Right, just after the moon landing.
Yeah, same, exactly. Yeah, 2 months later. And both my grandfathers had seen very serious active service. And that was definitely around in sort of our families. It wasn't really spoken about all that much, but it was present. There was a really intriguing discussion in our family about the past and about what people did. I was very aware that everybody that was talked about did something or made something. So my dad's side of the family they were Swiss, and they had been watchmakers, and they had been camera makers.
Perfect. Let's talk about watchmaking, right?
Yeah. So I was just born into this kind of soup of history and storytelling about making. And so when we're now talking about how to be a good ancestor, I have some really interesting role models. Like one guy, this one great-great-great-grandparent, he was actually a chemist in Switzerland. It was around the time that photography was exploding as a new medium. And he developed the chemistry that enabled fast film to be used and processed. So what that means is, until that point, really, so much photography was just done in studios, you know, and people had to sit still for bloody ages, and they had like metal frameworks that held their arms in the right position so they could have a nice portrait. And he created the chemicals which enabled them to take fast shots in daylight. And in a way, what he did is he had a camera company, but he took tons and tons of photos just to see if his film was working. And so in a way, it became one of the first examples really of street photography, because he was just going out and shooting people, like kids skipping, people jumping into the lake to see if the water would be suspended in the air rather than just blurring. Those sort of experiments and that kind of legacy of thinking and making and exploring were sort of foundational, I think, to me as a child.
And another of your ancestors was a carriage maker, right?
Yeah, that was my dad's granddad, yeah. Fred Osgerby, yeah. Famous Fred Osgerby, freeman of the town of Beverley in Yorkshire. He used to make hansom cabs. Mm. And they obviously had wheelwrights and stuff. And actually, so consequently, we ended up with all this stuff in our shed that was sort of tools, you know, from 1920 and stuff. And I guess so many of those skills were sort of lost really by the invention of the internal combustion engine. I can't really be bitter about that, but you know, so much of the woodworking skills were sort of lost in that era. Mm. But yeah,
I mean, I'm struck that the Second World War created so many fractures, and yet this sort of tradition of making, we could say, you know, persisted and led all the way to you and your path today.
Yeah, of course it did, yes. But I suppose that's in a way one of the benefits of growing up in a small town surrounded by family, because those stories endure, you know, and it wouldn't have been the same if we'd been disassociated or we were living in a different place, you know. So those narratives, I think, I find them really interesting, and in a way, not just the sort of faculty of being able to produce, to make, but also the ability to tell stories, I think, is so important in our world of design, creation.
So, extending out of storytelling, ancestry, etc., what do you makes a good design, or what is good design?
Well, that's an easy one, isn't it? What makes good design? What is good design? Fuck. One of the interesting things that happened to me last year, this isn't a complete side swipe, by the way. I was in Tallinn in Estonia, and I was doing a lecture there, and the sort of hosts took me to the design museum in Tallinn. I don't know if you've ever been, but it's actually a really beautiful design museum, as well as it was sort of, that part of the world in a way was almost the birthplace of plywood, which was interesting to me, obviously, with the Icon connection. But I was there with the host and a couple of other people, and what struck me was when we went into the 20th century gallery, how certain objects really resonated with everybody. And it made me realize that, of course, as part of the Soviet Union, they'd had a real scarcity of supply of actual things. And so the things that they had were common. And so they shared them, and they would talk about, I don't know, let's say it was a soap dish, but it was the soap dish that everybody had. And if you were lucky enough to have 2 or 3 bathrooms, you'd have 2 or 3 soap dishes. And there's something there that taught me about the importance of scarcity in production, because with scarcity comes meaning more so than overproduction. And I think possibly you also get the ability then to develop narratives and memories around objects which are scarce. And especially in this sense, when it's a collective memory, it was really powerful. So in terms of good design, what do I think? Of course, we studying in the 80s and early 90s, we were very much of the sort of swinging between the dichotomy of Dieter Rams and Sotsas. So you've got Memphis fighting with rationalism. We were taught very much that obviously the rationalism, effectiveness, cost focus, available for everybody was the answer. And really that still is generally what most people would say. But I think there's something that's overlooked there. And we used to talk about an object requiring a soul, something that spoke back to you, something that could unveil new things to you over time, so that an object which you fall in love with somehow, rather like a person, becomes more meaningful over time. And I think that's true, but I also think there's one other thing that's missing, and I think it's the idea of somehow carrying memory in objects and how we do that. Because I think when an object carries memory and that's part of its soul, then I think you've really got something special, something really wonderful, which somebody will fall in love with and want to keep for a very long time.
Totally agree. I mean, the way objects tell stories. I'm a little spoiled in that I get to interview a lot of the people who design the things in my home.
Yeah.
But one other definition that you've said in the past that I wanted to bring up, which I love, is that good design is something that listens as much as it speaks.
Yeah.
And this idea of listening in an object, basically making room for, allowing multiple uses, maybe even multiple interpretations.
Obviously, looking at the bellhop lamp, which is actually why I'm in New York, because I'm actually here for Floss to talk about the family. But whilst we're on the subject of objects, the bellhop lamp, it's one of those projects that could only happen at a particular time. So it happened at a time when battery power enabled us to be able to have a chargeable lamp, which in turn enabled us to create something that didn't need to be plugged in all the time, obviously, which in turn enabled us to be able to create an object that you could walk around with, that you could take light with you. And that plays with the collective memory of candlelight and the portability of a candle, the little candles that you'd hold to walk up from a sort of communal space up to your bedroom, even 100 years ago, 200 years ago. It's a very common archetype, and it's a really well understood way of using something. And when I'm talking about memory, it enabled us to trigger the memories, the collective memories, the ancient memories of being able to be mobile with light and take light with you, which on one hand is functionally great, but of course in a much more sort of profound way makes us feel safe.
Connects to your 2012 Olympic torch too.
Yeah, exactly. Slightly less dangerous than running around your house with a gas burner, but yeah, no, it's true. But again, it's a bit different. The 2012 torch it had to have collective meaning, and we played on collective memory and actually storytelling, but it needed a level of, I suppose, symbolism, partly for people to engage with it, but also partly because the torch relay was so long, 70 days, we had to give the TV commentator something to talk about. So it had to have layers of meaning, and there were so many in that project.
There's a certain sense of timelessness to your designs, and I know this is such an overused term, timelessness, but I think it does really connect to what makes good design. You know, I'm sitting next to Noguchi's Prism table, which I know you've actually, for a benefit auction,
we've done a cut and
in
shut
France,
version.
did this really wacky orange kind of wild version. But I think that there is something really special about how a design can stand the test of time, how a design becomes timeless by reason of its material and design integrity. It's the way that it's put together. It almost feels inevitable. Oftentimes it disappears. You almost forget it's there because it just fits in.
Yeah, well, actually, one of the things that was, I suppose, got me into design in the beginning and thinking about that is, as a kid, growing up in the countryside, we were quite close to Oxford. And in Oxford, there's the most amazing collection of anthropological objects called Pitt Rivers Museum. I don't know if you've ever been there. You must go the next time you're there. But what was fascinating about that, even to me as a kid, was that the collection wasn't curated region by region or time frame by time frame, but it was more about object types. So what you could see was, for example, I don't know, let's think like a hammer, for example, or a spoon. They would be collected, you'd have something that was used for those functions in each of these vast cabinets. It was really easy to see that how different societies across the world had used their resourcefulness to create something to solve the same problem, but all in a different way. But how all of these objects, they had something about them. There was obviously thought. There was years of evolution of handwork in them so that the forms had become perfect representations of that culture. And I know this is a departure from the Noguchi side table, but there is something about that level of thought and evolution of idea that gives an object the right to exist. It's just right.
Hey everyone, taking a quick break here to tell you a little bit about our Season 12 presenting sponsor, the high jewelry Maison Van Cleef & Arpels, which this year is collaborating with the American Museum of Natural History in New York to present the exhibition Cosmic Splendor, Jewelry from the Collections of Van Cleef & Arpels, an awe-inspiring assemblage of dozens of jewelry creations, timepieces, and precious objects with astronomical references. Featuring nearly 70 celestial, mythological, and astrological jewelry creations that celebrate the wonders and mysteries of the cosmos, the exhibition presents an enchanting universe of jewelry from the Maison's patrimonial collection, as well as contemporary creations, some of them on loan from private collections. You can purchase admission tickets or learn more about Cosmic Splendor at amnh.org/exhibitions. That's amnh.org/exhibitions. And now, back to the episode. I love that you bring up Oxford because I actually wanted to mention there's a couple of examples of Barber Osgerby designs that I think really stand out in this way that you're talking about. And one of them is the Bodleian Libraries chair, which you did for the Bodleian Libraries at Oxford.
Yeah.
So that's kind of a fun full circle.
Yeah, that's true. And that was one of the, there have been a couple of projects over the years that Ed and I have really gone for. They're often, they've been competitive. Like the Olympic torch was incredibly competitive.
Right.
The Bodleian chair project was also a competition, but it was something that meant something to both of us, because I think, if I'm right in thinking this, Ed's grandfather, I think, had been involved with the university, possibly the chancellor even. I think it was Oxford or Cambridge. Anyway, he was involved with the colleges. And obviously for me, being a local lad, it meant an awful lot to me. Putting that aside, the commission itself was quite incredible because, it's one of the oldest, if not the oldest library in the world. They've only had 3 chairs, I think, since 17-something.
Yeah, across 300 plus years.
Yeah,
it's
so,
wild.
That was quite a lot to live up to. And again, of course, like all of these things, and what makes these projects so amazing is that the requirements were so crazy, It was like, you have to create a chair that sits in this incredible architecture where a reader can sit for 12 hours a day. We actually then we studied, of course, what the readers are reading, and they're not reading like paperbacks. They're reading these huge, massive books, which are maybe, I don't know, 3 foot wide when they're open. And they're having to wear white gloves. And it's like they need a really interesting range of movement to be able to turn the page, So I'm sort of demonstrating this for your listeners. And of course, having just done the Tipton chair for Vitra, or a couple of years before, we'd already established that some sort of movement was helpful to try and promote circulation and help you concentrate by oxygenating your brain. So we took some of the good bits of the Tipton chair and incorporated them into the Bodleian chair as well. So that the Bodleian chair is quite a big oak thing with a leather seat. It's like constructed like a drum. It's super comfortable. But when you lean forward, the chair tips up. So you can actually move, but without mechanism, because you don't really want office chairs in the Bodleian Library. That really wouldn't do, would it?
No. And you're designing this thing into this, 300-year history.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the things that I love most about what we do, or design generally, is that, I think time is this thing which is a layer that sits over us every day. It's like in the old days before digital radios, how you had a band on the top of a radio, and it's like FM, medium wave, ultra high frequency, whatever it was. And you tracked that. In a way, that's sort of how I visualize me in time. You can track left and right to pick up different frequencies and different energies and different references. I think that's one of the most lovely things about creating anything. How you borrow from the past, think about the future, but create now.
The other design I wanted to bring up is an earlier one, the Portsmouth bench from 2002 for the Portsmouth Cathedral. I think connects very much to the Bodleian Library's chair.
Yes, it does,
But maybe just share for the listeners a little bit about this bench, which I know it might sound dull to talk about a bench, but to do that for the Portsmouth Cathedral, this building, that dates back to 1180.
The things that you're talking about are actually really interesting, because they're things which aren't, we don't often talk about them, but actually that project was possibly interesting for different reasons. There's a time aspect. There's also I think it was a time when it was quite early on for us, that project. And of course we did it with Chris McCourt from Isocon, with whom we've done so many great things. But I guess in a way that project emphasizes what I was talking about before about functionality, and of course, if you're designing something for an ecclesiastical interior, there's something, especially in the UK, about less being more, in the sense that, we're talking about the Church of England. We're not talking about the Catholic Church. So, bearing in mind Henry VIII, we had to do a really good job of creating something which was quite pared down and not too ornamented, which sat really well with our design aesthetic at the time. And of course, again, using oak was a perfect material because, well, most woods, but certainly oak, has that incredible ability to almost vitrify over hundreds of years, so you're creating something that could well be there in 500 years' time. And again, I think there's something about materiality, the materiality of oak, which has some sort of frequency or resonance, that when you hold it or touch it, it somehow talks back to you as well, physically, as well as sort of in the form of it. Aside from that, we needed to make things which, again, the brief was interesting because it was, I think initially anyway, for the choir stalls. So it's for the choir boys to sit on, so again, you can imagine rows and rows of fidgety boys and girls waiting to stand up and sing. So there was, in a way, there was a visual quality of the brief. And the answer was something that needed to just, again, sit at a place in time which was ambiguous. As far as I'm concerned, they could well have been designed really at any point after the arts and crafts movement, if not before, actually. So it was about choosing something or creating something that we loved, but that we knew could sit anywhere on that radio band,
There's something about your studio that I think, it could be what the craft scholar Glenn Adamson calls the sort of fewer, better things approach. And I would say even more so in recent years, you scaled this thing up and now it's almost like a right sizing moment.
Yeah.
Could you talk about that? Like how you're doing less work now by choice and how you decide which projects to do? I mean, there's this sort of intentionality and restraint to the way you operate.
Yeah, I think that's interesting. I think we definitely had there was a period of time when we were producing a lot more. In a way, maybe this comes back to the time thing. There was a period of time, certainly I felt this, where, life was too short. And I think, there were various things that have happened in my life that have made that sort of, given that more meaning, like needing to really take advantage of every minute. And I think that was reflected in the work. Suddenly we actually became highly productive. But I feel like maybe we're in a new chapter where things are genuinely more thought through, considered. And I think more than ever, we have to be certain that the object and the ideas justify the production of something. So I don't know whether that's just a natural part of getting older, where you become more reflective and look for more meaning in things. But it's an interesting observation. It feels like the studio is pretty busy. But actually, I think there's a lot of energy that's going into thinking.
Well, I think you're also coming of age, at this time in which the climate crisis wasn't something people were talking about back in the late 80s, early 90s so much. It was just bubbling up. Bill McKibben was just publishing his early work. And then I would also say, naturally you reflect, but I think in terms of globalization, the cost of production, the way things are made, AI, we can get into all these subjects.
Yeah.
This is all happening at the same time as your time is evolving.
That's
right?
true. Yeah, it's true, actually. I think we've always been, as a studio, always conscious that we want to make the good stuff. And in the early years, we made the difficult decision as young, kind of penniless student-stroke designers that we didn't want to just take on any brief from anybody. We were very lucky early on that we started working with Isocon and with Chris, because he taught us a lot about making, and also the pace of working with a small producer like Isocon.
And simple, humble materials.
Simple, humble materials. Yeah, and actually being so intimately connected with the production, They had bag presses and lathes and pillar drills and all the stuff that you could use right opposite where we rented a small space next to it's not really a factory. I don't want to call it a factory, workshop. So right next to the workshop, and we were in there the whole time. And actually, I think that was probably more important than the RCA years, because we learned so much about what goes into making something. That was great. But those years were, a self-imposed restriction on what we produced, because we wanted to be able to, we dreamt of working with the great producers. We wanted to work with Floss and Vitra and those people. So we waited and waited and waited. And then it finally happened, of course. And all of those, well, most of those, not all of them, but even back in the sort of mid-90s, people were already switched on to the fact that, we're not here to damage the world. We're here to actually make great stuff. And that's been consistent with them over the years.
Well, I think this evolution, right? Next year marks 30 years of Barber Osgerby.
Yeah.
So I wanted to ask, what does this time marker mean to you? And how do you think about the role of the designer evolving in that time? Like, what's changed since you began in 1996?
So much has changed. I don't even know where to start with what's changed. I'm not talking about our studio particularly, but the landscape has changed so radically. And there are some really exciting things actually now that are present. I think it's very typical for an older person to sort of be critical of the world, but actually it's totally not about that. It's just really different. There was a lot of effort that went into getting work out then. So I'll give you an example. We designed the loop table originally for nobody particularly.
It was for a restaurant, right?
It was for a restaurant. Yeah. And it didn't, and it was, the restaurant didn't have the budget for it. So it sat on the shelf for years as a card model for a couple of years, until a friend sort of said, oh, that's interesting. And I think what's interesting about the loop table is that it personifies for me the intersection between architecture and furniture, because even as a model, it was ambiguous. Was it a pavilion or was it a table or what was it? It could have been either actually, but it was always supposed to be a sort of table. And we produced the loop table. And of course, in whenever it was, 1996, you had to get a camera from somewhere, take some transparencies, actually put the transparencies in an envelope and send them to magazines to get, and hope, keep fingers crossed and chase these things up that they were received to try and just get your work out and about. And I think there's something, what's interesting about that, I think, is that the sheer friction of trying to be a designer in those days was actually quite a good barrier to entry. Because if you wanted to be a designer, you really, really, really had to want to, because it was really hard work to get your work out, and in a way that it's so different today, because you can have an idea and it can be rendered on Instagram in 25 minutes and it can look real. And I think that's
you can have thousands of people responding to it.
Yeah, and they can love it. And if they love it enough, you can make it, which is wonderful on the one hand, but it comes back to the thing I was saying before about the importance of scarcity. Because I think what happens is there's an oversupply. There's a visual, we're all bombarded with an oversupply of visual stimulus, right? And actually what happens now is when you have a really brilliant idea for something, very often it's been done in a form or it's been claimed visually, even if it hasn't been realized. And that's super off-putting, So I'm sure that for the young guys and girls today who are wanting to be designers, it's incredibly difficult to be able to find your own position, because it feels like the entire landscape has already been well-trodden. So I do have a real concern, I think, for them. Because actually design is oversupplied as an image, not necessarily the actual thing. But I guess the other thing to say is that what has changed over the last 30 years is that as a graduate and as a young designer, you had to really try and find design. You could buy a couple of magazines, and I worked in a newspaper shop as a teenager, actually. It was my great uncle's shop, and I managed to persuade him to get a Blueprint magazine, knowing that nobody in my small town would really be interested in Blueprint magazine, but it enabled me to read it in my tea break. But finding design was difficult. I mean, I would come to London as a sort of slightly older teenager and go to see Ron Arrad's shop or go to Paul Smith's shop and try and find design. I remember how exciting it was to come and see the Lloyd's building when it was first built. And I actually, I'd like hitchhiked to London to go and see it just because I wanted to somehow be near design, because it was that type of, that sounds really sad, doesn't it now? But, coming from a small town, it was like, it meant everything to me to be able to have that kind of contact. But there were a few places, sort of late 80s, early 90s, where design existed, but there were few and far between. And of course now, good design as we would have understood it then is ubiquitous. It's everywhere. You can buy it in every shop. You can buy it on so many websites. And of course, that's wonderful because people have access to affordable design, but we run the risk of creating something where there's just so much sameness.
Yeah, and no meaning. Back to what we were talking about, having objects that are imbued with meaning, with story.
Yeah. And so that's one of the reasons that I've enjoyed working with Creo.
Gallery Creo.
So it's like coming off the motorway and going onto a small road into another place, where you can take time to create fewer objects that have more meaning. And of course, that's really the antithesis of the Ram's way of thinking and the modernism, because we're creating a few things for a handful of people. But as a creative mind, it's a playground for experimentation and actually being able to imbue meaning into objects that don't necessarily make sense to hundreds of thousands of people, but it makes sense to 8 people. For me, that's one of the most interesting places to work at the moment.
I wanted to bring up just the fact also that AI was not really a conversation in 1996.
No, nor was the internet. Barely.
Yeah, barely. I mean, 1996 was also a moment in which you were just creating this table, just doing your first restaurant. I think it was Tyler Brûlé, right? Who saw and published the Loop table. That was correct. Sort of your first media moment. Yeah. To think that things
I would just add, though, we did send the transparencies to Wallpaper magazine after a very funny conversation when Wallpaper phoned the studio and we kind of hung up because we were like, a magazine about wallpaper, that's 100% not what we're into. Luckily, they called back.
Yeah. I mean, everyone needs their sort of early press moment, right? Just some way to launch. But I wanted to bring it back to this moment, which is like just thinking about how then everything felt so analog. So mail the photography for the print magazine, right? But then, of course, the internet happens. The iPhone's created. Smartphones are in our pockets.
Yeah.
And now with AI, I don't know that AI is going to, quote, change everything like everyone talks about, but I do think it is going to and already has had this incredible transformative impact on the way things are made, on the way we consume information, probably in how some people have discovered this very podcast, you know, just how digital life moves. Probably even, you know, a conversation to be had with an AI expert at time, the relationship to time.
Well, I can talk to you a little bit about that because whilst I spend a lot of time working with Ed on furniture and products, I have my head in a number of other things. In fact, Ed and I started a company called MAP in 2012. In fact, we started a couple of other studios with other disciplines because, well, there's a whole nother story there, but I think we just tried to create college again around us. But one of the departments in this new college that we created was a very technologically focused studio called MAP. And MAP does a tremendous amount of work with IBM and worked on IBM's quantum program, including Series 1. And in fact, I'm probably going to go to Yorktown on Thursday to go and see them. Yeah, so I've also recently been working on AI products and services just to try and, for a client, but through MAP. And I have to admit, I find it fascinating. I love the fact that I can be working in Murano with Vanini on a project with Creo 1 minute, and I can be really talking about the future of humanity through technology the next. I mean, it's that type of diversity that keeps me interested and engaged and thinking. And I think the way to think about AI and actually technology as a whole is it's optional. So as I said before about the idea of taking like coming off the motorway and going onto a side street or a side road to find things, we always have the option not to engage with it. You know, it's there for us as a tool or another layer, as we were saying before. But I think we always have the capacity and the option to live in an analog environment.
Completely agree.
To switch off.
Completely agree.
Yeah.
That's why I think AI is not going to change everything. I think it will change a lot of things, but it's how we engage it. I mean, even Sam Altman has talked about things like human creativity, attention to detail, the human touch. In our age of AI, these aspects of craft, they're not going to disappear. In fact, they'll probably become more important, not less.
I think that they really are essential. And actually, if ever there was a moment to think about what a product means, it's when you're introducing a new technology to people, because people are terrified. They don't understand it. They don't understand how to interact with it. I mean, this is a thing that doesn't really need buttons. It doesn't need the classic kind of modes of interaction that we grew up with. We're talking about how do you create a form and a materiality that actually enables a character to coexist with your life, you know, in terms of an AI agent. What does that look like? And that's what I've been thinking about. It's fascinating. It really is fascinating because it brings reality to the notion of objects and meaning, doesn't it? And I think the other thing, of course, to think about, we've spoken about how important memory is in association with objects, but what does that mean in an era of AI? When memories can be created, recreated, you know, and reconstructed and constructed from scratch. There's so many interesting things to explore here.
I mean, these people with aging parents who have them get their voices recorded, the idea that your parent can speak to you from the afterlife.
I know. Yeah, I know.
It's wild.
I mean, I would stick to the medium there. You know, just cross the paths with, what is it? Cross the palm with silver and actually engage with the real past.
Yeah.
I don't know. I love it. I love this part of what's happening at the moment because let's just talk about it from an industrial design point of view. So I had this conversation with my kids when we were arguing about when they were going to get a mobile phone. And they said, well, how old were you when you had your first mobile phone? And I was like, 26. And The fact is, during that period, so like mid-90s to the early 2000s, think how many form factors and shapes and God knows what there were for mobiles, cell phones. And that was, it's like a whole candy store of options and interactions. It was a real playground for industrial design at that time. And here we are again. This is it. We're going to have the same thing happen because it's going to be a decade probably before the form of AI gets consolidated into, a form factor that's universal, as we have with the phone now. So it's an open season for industrial design with AI, which in itself is really interesting. Mm-hmm. But putting aside the form and the materiality of the task, how we as designers enable this new intelligence to coexist with people in people's homes. And think about how diverse humans' homes are across the planet. Even those things, how do we find a universality of meaning in this new paradigm? It's fascinating.
We talk about screen time, but really we're only 20, 30 years into the computer as we know it.
Yeah.
And not even 18 years into the iPhone. So,
yes,
it's wild to me. I think, if we take a long view here, like in the far off future, they'll be like, oh, that was the screen time era.
It's true. No, you're right. And it's like the typing pool in the office. It's going to just seem so out of date. And I think what's interesting about sort of this new world of voice activated intelligence is that we'll be liberated from looking down at screens and we'll be able to look up again at the world. We'll actually be able to look around us and experience the real world that we live in again, instead of, what they call in some parts of the world smart walking, which is just walking with your phone and then being hit by a car. So I do believe that one of the great things about this new paradigm is that it'll make people, it's actually more human than the way that we have been interacting with devices. And that'll enable us consequently to be more human in our environments.
Yeah. Slow down, engage the senses.
Yeah.
Pay attention.
Yeah. And look at the world.
The critic Rowan Moore has written about Ed and you and how when you talk about making things that you really come alive.
Oh, really?
He wrote this a while back. And I think it's fair to say that even though you're not necessarily makers yourselves in the traditional maker sense, you're obsessed with making. And it's through materials and manufacturing that the work you've done has really come to life. Process-wise, when you're making something or designing something, it's a process of model making. It's a process of learning how the thing would be manufactured.
Yeah.
It's going to factories. It's learning about machines. That's everything when it comes to your work in some sense.
I think you're quite right about that. What I'd say about that is that our experience of creating objects has been a continuation of our learning. And part of that continuation of learning has been that sometimes when we work on projects, you're not always clear on what your constraints are. And it's when you get the opportunity to interact with the makers, whether it's a craftsperson or whether it's a semiconductor factory, you understand another level of complexity. And because we've always worked, well, we've never worked in isolation, even at the beginning it was two of us. So we started our practice as a collaborative practice. And I think one of the successes of our studios has been the fact that they were all created to collaborate. We're not pointing and saying this is how it has to be. We're saying this is how we see it. How do we get there? And so I think when we talk a lot about the making process, it's very often to do with the fact that we're listening to people who really understand. And it's that collaboration that helps us create a beautiful object on the one hand, but also continues this collegiate style of learning. And I think so long as there's an opportunity to learn in what we're doing, we'll remain engaged. And I think at some point when the learning stops, that'll be when it's time to stop.
Hey everyone, taking another quick break here to tell you about our weekly newsletter, where I share a behind-the-scenes look into each time-sensitive episode, and where we also get into various things in the cultural sphere our team at The Slowdown is paying attention to. You can sign up and join our thousands of other subscribers by going to slowdown.media/newsletter. That's slowdown.media/newsletter. And now, back to the episode. How would you classify or think about your manufacturing time or your factory time, if I could call it? Like, you're somebody who has spent an incredible amount of time around machines and craftspeople and different forms of maker.
Yeah. Most extreme things, really, when you think about it. So how do I feel about that? I feel like it's the best bit of the job. For me, spending a day with a craftsperson, like I can think of so many, like real diverse characters as well, really diverse. There's another thing, of course, which is sometimes the manufacturers are really grumpy. The guys are really like, they don't want to help. They don't want to go the extra 10%. So there's something there as well about being coercive, not coercive, that's the wrong word, possibly coercive, persuasive.
Convincing.
Convincing, thank you. That's the word. It's about, having enough energy in the room to try and bring people on that. Oh, God, I believe I'm going to say bring people on the journey. That's so naff. But you know what I mean. Get people to do what you want.
Yeah.
In a nice way.
Yes.
So the feeling of satisfaction from collectively creating something of beauty that starts the day as not beautiful and ends the day as something when even the guy who was grumpy in the morning is sitting there scratching his head and you can see that he's proud of what's happened in the day. That's a real wonderful thing. I feel so happy that I've spent the last 30 years being able to work with these characters. And a lot of the characters are people who have been on the scene at the time of our heroes. These are people who have worked with, Vico Magistretti, who have worked with Castiglione, who have worked with, the greats. The people who we looked up to as our heroes. Those people in those workshops with those overcoats on are still there, they were young people back in the day, and now they're the old guys who are really, really wise and who you learn everything from, especially in Italy. But it happens everywhere. And I think the most amazing thing about the position I'm in really is that I do get to spend time with such diverse and interesting people across the world,
Who are such incredible specialists in what they do.
Who are complete specialists. Yeah. And you can only imagine what their homes are like. I mean, I just look at some of these people and I think, I wish I could see what your chez vous is like. Can you imagine some of these people who like such incredible attention to detail, but very often on one thing. They fixate, they're very, very knowledgeable about one particular technique in leather, for example, or in other forms of upholstery, or in injection molding or tooling, It's incredible. It's incredible. And I that's the best bit of the job. It's definitely not the bit where you're getting slapped on the back at a launch of something. It's not that for me at all. It's the struggle to get there.
Tell me about your experience in Japan with Ozeki and Company, because I think this is an interesting example in the context of specialists who are really good at making something.
Yeah.
And this is an old family-run company that used to make those Japanese paper lanterns, still do. That's a part of their business. But they were sort of reinvented in the 40s and 50s by Noguchi, and now you've come to work with them.
Yeah, so in fact, they were in the studio last week. They were in London. I think it was, again, when we're talking about the heroes, and I know that Noguchi was a big hero for you as well. He was a sculptor that dabbled in design, but in the most effective, precise way you could imagine. And he's a really good example of a maestro, really. Somebody who actually managed to put a sort of soul into everything he did. And of course, the paper lights that you're referring to are a really good example of him being able to create sculpture in a way that was so different from everything else he did, because most of the work he did was concerned so much with the weight of the material, the density of the material, whether it's stone or wood. The ability to be able to play with light and lightweightness is a really interesting extension of that in sculpture. And our relationship with them started I can't remember when it was. It was a while. It was a long time ago, actually. And it was because Ed was traveling to Japan, I think, for a project called Japan Creative that we did a number of years ago. And he went to visit them. And obviously, we would been incredibly familiar with them, partly because Vitra, the main distribution in Europe. But, it was something that we always wanted to do. So Ed went there and managed to persuade them that it would be a really good idea to do a collection with Barber Osgerby, which is a really great situation. And then we actually had to help them kind of construct a new business model because they didn't really have any way of distributing in the UK. So in the way, and this is something that happens quite a lot for us, design as an approach extends into business as well. So we actually had to use our sort of creative thinking skills to try and figure out how on earth we could persuade this beautiful company to do something new outside of the Noguchi collection, but also that could be distributed in a design world in Europe. And it's been an ongoing relationship for a number of years and really successful for us, but always so difficult for us to find a language which is meaningful outside of the Noguchi realm, because he did so many of the lights. He cornered the market, you could say. And we're just trying to sort of work around the edges to try and find something that justifies its existence, that's meaningful, but doesn't tread on the toes of the master himself.
I mean, it's not totally unlike that bench we were talking about earlier.
Yeah.
It's extending something into the future respectfully as a real evolution, not as a copy.
But that's interesting as well, because when you look at paper lights, in a way, it's the antithesis of what we're talking about, because you think, well, that's going to last about 10 minutes. But of course, they're not. They're made from incredibly thick mulberry paper, and they, as we can all see, can last for 100 years. They really do last a long time, and they're such an amazingly powerful object to create atmosphere in a space. So I'm just coming to the end of a big project that I've been doing personally in the South Downs in England, where we bought an old cart lodge, which was originally built around 1750, 1780. Anyway, yeah, I've got Noguchi lights going in really high up in the eaves of this thing. And again, I suppose that's another example of something where about the time factor, like making something or repairing something to give it to extend its life. We found this old thing that was falling down, beautiful barn in a beautiful part of the world, but still it was minutes away from collapsing, and I stupidly bought it. But it's been a really interesting process of trying to, I don't know, like architecturally save something, but not, it's a very fine line between overdoing something and respecting what was there. So the oak there, bearing in mind it was made or constructed, we think, around 1780 or 90, the oak was already previously used on another building or on a ship, because it always had the cutouts in it from previous use. So thinking about the timeline on that, we're working on the basis that those trees were probably planted around 900 and something or 10 something, Some of the beams actually are really crazy. They've got apopatreic marks on, which are anti-witch marks, which were put on structures to ward away witches. So I'm hoping they still work. But anyway, they're going to be enjoying the soft light that comes from some very large Noguchi lights in a couple of months' time.
The place I really want to go back to is sort of where we began this interview with the Loop coffee table, which next year, like your firm, will be 30. And,
wow, yeah.
And I love this idea of it being a loop, this sort of full circle, right? Thinking about your practice as a loop or time as a circle, how do you think about this moment right now? And perhaps that table in the context of it, but maybe even everything we've discussed, your ancestry going back, the circles of time that we exist in, object-wise or,
That's an interesting one. When you talk about a loop, immediately I suppose I think about an envelope, an envelope of time or a package. So perhaps it's, in a way, as you say, it envelops 30 years of work. 30 years of work that I'm really proud of, actually. It's been an amazing 30 years. And yeah, I think it's interesting, isn't it? And maybe that in a way envelopes that period of time. There was a time before and there's a time to come. But those 30 years were amazing. And you're right, it's a really nice way of kind of finishing up.
And so what's next? I mean, I know you work on dozens of projects at any given moment.
Yeah.
What's occupying your mind right now as you look forward?
Well, again, I think it's a lot of this diversity that I was talking about before, really. I think it's we as a studio are always restless. You know, we're always thinking about the challenges. And I think, as we were saying earlier on, some of the technological aspects are presenting us with the most challenging things, the most challenging questions to answer. And I think that's what we've always wanted to do, you know, answer those difficult ones, the difficult questions. I don't think the future is about a bunch more chairs. You know, I think there will be more chairs. There will be more things, but I think each time that we create something new, we have to really think about why we're doing it. And I don't just mean from an environmental point of view. I think that goes without saying. I think it's in terms of legacy too. I think you need to be careful that everything you do still has that kind of creative energy and authenticity and longevity. Of course, the more you do, the harder that gets.
Let's end there.
Yeah. Sure, that was good.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thanks very much. Thanks for the coffee. It was very good.
Extra thanks to our Season 12 presenting sponsor, the high jewelry maison Van Cleef & Arpels. Since its founding in Paris's Place Vendôme in 1906, Van Cleef & Arpels has developed a distinctive blend of poetry and refinement. With its jewelry and watchmaking collections, the Maison is an invitation to a timeless universe of beauty and harmony. You can discover more at vancleefarpels.com. That's VANCLEEFARPELS.com. And thank you for listening. You can find more episodes of Time Sensitive on our website, timesensitive.fm, or wherever you listen to podcasts. To keep up with our latest time-sensitive episodes and get behind-the-scenes updates, sign up for our newsletter at slowdown.media/newsletter. That's slowdown.media/newsletter. You can follow us on Instagram at slowdown.media. Our theme music was composed by Billy Martin. This episode was produced by Ramon Broza, Olivia Almer, Mimi Hannon, and Johnny Simon.